I hope that after eating 2 Indian curries, your sensitive stomachs are still all right. Because many of them are coming to India for the first time, so our food can have an effect on people's. I was just listening to the discussions yesterday afternoon, the nuclear and missile technology issues things, and I was really enjoying it. I was on because we host it, we was listening to it. And we hope that this session where we look at India, Japan, and US history, opportunities, and challenges. It'll be interesting to see the historical aspects of it because traditionally, of course, we've dealt with each other very, very separately. How India looked at Japan, or India looked at the USA, and we say the Japan-US relationship, of course, is an entirely different level of. It's operating at a very, very different level for a very, very long time. And how does one link it to contemporary realities is something I think that I hope to find out more about from our 3 young speakers. So let me restrain myself from speaking longer and request Mr. Tomaki Hagito to speak on Japan's post-war path from the paradigm of national security, the shifting patterns of Japan-US strategic relations in the Indo Pacific area. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Director Shakti Sinha. And good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for organizing the conference to give this opportunity. And today I would like to talk about Japan post-war path from the paradigm of national security with special attention to the shifting patterns in the Indo-Pacific area. This presentation aims to review the process of Japanese foreign policy toward geostrategic leverage to build the alliance with the U.S. and revive its economy after the Second World War. American consent to the security arrangement with Japan in 1960 meant the achievement of the stable supply of U.S. bases in Japan, while preventing Japanese neutralism that might attempt a break with the U.S. on the potential and military question in East Asia. In 1960s, the U.S.-Japanese Security Treaty was codified without having to revise the Japanese Constitution, indicating the treaty and Constitution can still coexist. The Japanese Constitution forbade Japan to have military forces. In effect, it set the limit of 0% on Japan's defense spending. For a long time, the Japanese government pretended that its military spending would not be in the violation of the Constitution if it stayed below 1% of GDP. After China had become a communist nation in 1949, the U.S. held the neutral stance toward Chinese civil war. However, after finishing communist nation in 1949, U.S. stand the neutral stance. However, the U.S. government resumed military aid to Taiwan when the Korean War broke out. U.S. Army had moved from Japan to Korea for the Korean War, and so the Japanese National Police Reserve, called Keisatsu Yobitai, and the Maritime Safety Agency, called Kaijou Keibitai in Japanese, were established as a part of the active military presence in Japan. U.S., also India, signed the Japanese Peace Treaty in 1951. It left out the issue of the returning Okinawa's administrative rights to Japan and making peace with 2 Chinas, I mean mainland China and Taiwan, and Soviet Union. but it promoted the nation's early recovery as a member of the Western-aligned powers. It also did not impose an enormous amount of war reparation on Japan. Security treaty with Japan was a military agreement for U.S. forces legally stationed in Japan. At the time, U.S. intended to seek Japan to add a military containment policy against the expansionism of China due to the possibility of its invasion in Indochina. Washington thus required Tokyo to rearm Japanese forces. On the other hand, accumulating economic difficulties and the reluctance or inability of the Japanese government to adopt energetic, economic, and rearmament policies were then seen as a prolonging Japanese dependence on the U.S. and delaying Japan's development as a counterweight to communist power in East Asia. U.S. Dwight Eisenhower administration took a stance to reduce military spending that had been expanding steadily due to the maintenance of a long-term defense system. U.S. new basic policy toward China also recognized it as a serious threat to Asia. Having fallen into the economic depression at the time, Japan attempted to acquire financial aid from the U.S. by emphasizing the need to improve its self-defense capacity. Thus, Japan amended National Safety Agency law in 1954 to convert the national safety forces into the self-defense forces called Jietai and give it the duty of defense against direct aggression. Meanwhile, the U.S. embarked on the re-examination of the policy toward Japan, fearing the rise of non-aligned and neutral nations. U.S. intended to pursue a new course of action, which included security arrangement, with the priority being to improve the economic situation and ensure political stability by maintaining the pro-American regime in Japan. The worst scenario for the U.S. was alliance between Japanese industrial capacity and Chinese and Soviet workforce on the continent. Add to this growing concern amongst the American government with the trend of anti-imperialism spreading in Asia, the Japanese Diet resolution prohibited the overseas dispatching of the self-defense forces in 1954. And the government established it did not recognize the right to collective self-defense in 1957. U.S. concerned that Japan was not willing to share the burden of the defense spending, relying heavily on us. So throughout the beginning of the post-war period, Washington requested Tokyo share the defense burden by keeping the right of free use of U.S. bases in Japan, with its contributing to the defense of non-communist nations as the requirements of the security division. In 1960, finally, the U.S. demonstrated an attitude of the political cooperation with Japan by proposing a limited agreement to use the base as a concession. As mentioned in the previous section, Japanese security policy constraints were infused with some exceptionalism, as they were believed to demonstrate Japan's unique peacefulness. In the Cold War period, Japan was contrasted with the Empire of Japan of the 1930s and 1940s, along with post-war militarizing states. However, those pushing for policy changes today seek to distinguish contemporary Japan from post-war Japan. In all its alleged weakness, masochism, and abnormality. Therefore, post-war Japan's deliberately constrained security policy has shifted from being predominantly an object of the pride to becoming mostly an object of shame. Current Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe calls for Japan to break out of the post-war regime, in typical of the differentiation between a weak past and a strong future. Many observers argue that the recent change in Japanese security policy have been adopted due to the external threat posed by China and North Korea. However, this raises the question of why Japan did not respond in the similar way to the Soviet Union threat during the Cold War. The Soviet Union destructive capacity far surpassed that of contemporary China, whose nuclear arsenal is far more modest. Moreover, the intense rivalry between American and Soviet superpower produced international tensions that were much higher than those present in the competitive but interdependent relationship between the U.S. and China. However, threat of the Soviet Union did not lead to the kind of the military build-up in Japan that has been taking place in response to China's rise. On the contrary, Japan responded during the Cold War by adopting military restrictions. It is precisely these restrictions which invoked pride and exceptionalism, a stark contrast to how they are construed and remembered today. These widely differing responses to the post-war security policy appear mystifying, through only if the changes in Japan's national identity are overlooked. The Cold War example demonstrates that not all potentially threatening developments are necessarily construed as such. So to make Japan differing responses to the nuclear programs of China and North Korea. After China conducted its thermometer test in 1967, Japan responded by introducing the three non-nuclear principles. By contrast, Japan's response to the North Korea's nuclear test in 2017 has been to push for preemptive strike capabilities. It sums up the difference between the international orientation based on relative pacifism and one based on proactive pacifism. The self-constraining response along the lines of the 1967 is simply unthinkable in Abe's Japan. The aggressiveness of the North Korea and China cannot be viewed in isolation, but must be seen against the backdrop of Japan's already changing self-understanding, according to which Japan is perceived as peaceful, democratic, and law-abiding, whereas China and Korea are viewed as a hostile, authoritarian, and anti-Japanese. Japan understands Chinese and Korean actions not just concerning these countries, but also to its past. In 2015, Japanese government passed a package of the controversial security bills that made it possible for Japan to participate in collective self-defense, that is, to respond militarily to attack on the friendly country as though Japan itself had been attacked. The bills overturned the interpretation that Japan's constitution forbid the country from engaging collective self-defense, a bill in Japanese government stood by for more than 60 years. The legislation on the collective self-defense means Japan can now do more or less everything that others, more normal countries, do in the security field. That is not normal amongst U.S. allies. Indeed, the 2015 security legislation and the 2014 cabinet resolution in Japan, on which it is based, are replete with the reference to the security environment that has been fundamentally transformed for the worse. There is now very little that Japan cannot do concerning a security policy that allegedly more normal country can. To be sure, the three no-nuclear principles from 1967 remain intact, although they were effectively breached in the 1969 when the Japanese government secretly agreed to allow the U.S. to introduce nuclear weapons to Japan. The final page. In 2011, the U.S. Obama administration initiated its pivot to Asia Pacific, which is perceived as one of the most critical strategic reorientation in the recent history of the American foreign policy. American rebalance to Asia was linked to a strategic handshake representing the convergence of the geopolitical interests alongside India's Act East policy. Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor project was aimed at the promotion of the stability and prosperity of the South and Southeast Asian economies. Among essential activities under this IPEC, there is the advancement of the regional economic connectivity. The IPEC may thus be considered through the prism of the hegemonic rivalry with China's Belt and Road Initiative over the influence in the Indian Ocean Rim, Asia Pacific, and the Eurasian regions. Therefore, the IPEC is a frame within which the U.S. is close cooperation with India, and one where Japan would attempt to determine the future economic and geopolitical order while countering China's ambitions. Since U.S. President Donald Trump's Indo-Pacific speech in the November 2070s, the free and open Indo-Pacific has drawn international attention. This FOIP is a strategic vision that primarily aims to maintain the existing international order that is premised on the set of the principles such as a rule of law, a free market economy, and fundamental rights in the Indo-Pacific region. In maintaining peace and stability, it is imperative for Japan to ensure the U.S. strategic commitment to the region, particularly in the responding to China's potential challenge to the existing international order, is vital in the context of its strategic outreach of the Eurasia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. Securing the vast geopolitical areas of the Indo-Pacific region requires cooperation with Japan's regional partners, ASEAN, India, and Australia. India, as a democratic state, is an essential player in safeguarding the existing international order, covering the Indian Ocean and Southern Pacific, respectively. The origin of Japan's role within the regional stability via the existing international order dates back to the Japanese Prime Minister Abe's 2007 speech at the Parliament of India. Abe's commitment to the Indo-Pacific region can be seen through his speech at 6th Tokyo International Conference in August 2016. Emphasizing the importance of economic development, the need for quality infrastructure, and the sea lines of the communication between the seas of Asia and the Indian Ocean. The core elements of the FOIP were therefore the freedom of navigation and overflight through enhancement of the rule of law and infrastructure and economic development, adhering to the international standards in the Indo-Pacific region. Although Tokyo is yet to indicate whether the FOIP is intended to be competitive against China or not. This is why the strategy is vague by design. Such vagueness allows Japan the flexibility in the policy response to the rapidly changing strategic environment. Japan-US summit were illustrated this in November 2017 for 3 reasons. First of all, Tokyo was able to get the US on board with the concept of the FOIP to keep China in check. Secondly, the two countries emphasized the importance of freedom of the navigation and economic development, which have been Japan's strategic concerns. Finally, both agree to non-exclusive nature of the strategy, which leaves Japan option open for the cooperation with China in the future. It is mainly the case for American policy toward China, which led to more competitive, antagonistic interaction, while Japan is attempting to engage with and shape China's behavior. To maintain strategic consistency and avoid misunderstanding, constant and close communication is critical in achieving agreed upon objectives. Japan will need to identify the detail of the FOIP for the involvement in the infrastructure project and maritime security in the 2 seas with India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zagito. I think the evolution of the... Lovely, thank you. That is very nice. Thank you very much for your appreciation. I think you really brought to us a very good picture of the changing Japanese position in view of the changing objective realities. The fact that the 3 no's of 1967 are obviously not really relevant in the context of today, and that once the Korean War was over, even though the Vietnam War took place, the battle lines between the 2 fronts, blocks, were in Europe, very, very far away from Japan. Obviously now it is quite different. So even though the arsenals may be much smaller, they are right next door. They are pointing towards you. They are not pointing the other direction. Obviously these realities have to be recognized, but the important part which Japan has made and India has made is the fact that our attitude is a non-exclusive attitude. So we are open and we are continuing with the process of cooperation also and not looking for conflicts. Moving from that to India, Japan and the pivot to Indo-Pacific, may I request Titli Basu, who is an associate fellow at IDSA, Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. Titli?
Thank you, sir. Good morning to all of you, and let me begin by thanking Director Shakti Sinha and Miyamoto-san of Japan Foundation, and also Dr. Pulipaka for providing this opportunity and organizing this very timely seminar. And I would pick up from where my previous speaker, Hagito-san, has left on the Indo-Pacific strategy. So let me share first, begin with some key observations on this Indo-Pacific theme. First of all, if we look at Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's strategic pursuit of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is, as Hagito-san rightly said, which is anchored on his conceptualization of the confluence of the 2 seas, and also founded on the pillars of universal values and norms, we see that India has been accorded a greater space in Japan's grand strategy today. And if you look at the strategic discourse that is evolving in the United States and in Japan on Indo-Pacific, India has emerged as a key variable in the geopolitical churning that is shaping this Indo-Pacific construct. As policy positions are articulated by our respective leaders, we have seen that President Trump and to some extent Prime Minister Abe has aligned their free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the primary objective being in a long term to secure and uphold the US-led strategic order. Japan has been a beneficiary of the US-led global order after the war. And the kind of policy positions that are being articulated from Washington today, whether we see when we look at the speeches by President Trump, or also the Hudson Institute famous speech by Pence, or the national security strategy, there is no shying away from acknowledging there is a great power competition that is unfolding. And China, in addition to Russia, is perceived as a competitor and as a revisionist kind of power, which is constantly threatening U.S. values and systems. So the primary objective is to secure the U.S.-led order as China is increasingly appearing in international affairs with claims of greater equity, with alternative ideas, institutions, infrastructure solutions, as we have seen over the last couple of years. Now, when we come to India's policy position on Indo-Pacific, there has been some ambiguity before the Shangri-La dialogue of Prime Minister Modi. But we have been able to articulate our position on Indo-Pacific quite clearly after Shangri-La, where we have perceived this concept as a free, open, and inclusive construct, where we are not we are not looking at it as a club of limited powers. In fact, he goes to the extent of saying it includes all countries, not only within the geography, but also beyond, which has a stake in the Indo-Pacific region. So how we interpret this policy position of Prime Minister Modi is anybody's guess, and we can keep on debating about the ambiguities around the articulation that we are seeing in the three capitals. But having said that, there are few elements, common elements in the Indo-Pacific strategy of all these three powers today, which is bringing together these three countries to cooperate in Indo-Pacific. Particularly, all the three, one of the common elements has been ASEAN centrality, as we see that there has been a dilution of ASEAN consensus. We have seen in the South China Sea issue and how China is actually getting its way, navigating its challenges in ASEAN through exploiting the divisions within ASEAN. So ASEAN centrality is a common feature in all the three Indo-Pacific vision that we are seeing. Secondly, in terms of concrete cooperation, I would say that building regional infrastructure and connectivity between the sub-regions of Indo-Pacific. It's a vast expanse, Indo-Pacific. So all the sub-regions are critically important. Because if you see the security, economic, and the political undercurrents of each sub-regions, if we talk about Bay of Bengal to South China, to East Asia, to Mekong region, all are defined by different set of political, security, and economic rationale. So, but having said that, these are dynamic, engines of economic growth. So there is a consensus that we need to develop robust infrastructure and connectivity between these sub-regions in order to tap the production networks, the value chains, and realize the full potential of Indo-Pacific in terms of economic growth. And also then there is this underlying theme of securing global commons, particularly maritime commons. So having said this broad framework, let me begin by what has been India's approach towards Indo-Pacific. Now, if you look at all the Asian powers, three Asian powers today, China, Japan, and India, we have asymmetrical comprehensive national power, but all three powers have been pursuing their geostrategic and geoeconomic interests solely guided by their national interests, which is true for any other country. Now, our approach towards geopolitical reality is shaped by a balance of engagement and autonomy. We have alignment of interest with Japan, so that is why we have cultivated a very robust framework of special strategic partnership with Japan. We have a joint Indo Pacific vision of 2025. And we have also seen convergence of economic and security interests, bringing India and US quite closer than what we actually imagined during the Cold War period. But having said that, this is not a zero-sum game. For India, it is more like a balance of interests. We have not been pursuing our relationship in isolation or at the cost of China. And this is not just true in case of India. If I look at Japan today, Japan also is pursuing its grand strategy by straddling its security and economic interests between the US, China, Japan triangle. So that is why you see today that India is a part of a trilateral framework, strategic frameworks with US and Japan, with Australia and Japan. You have seen Quad consultation back in the policy circuit. I will not talk about Quad particularly in this presentation because I think in the afternoon there are two presentations on Quad, so I will not step on it. So you will see that we have opened our engagement according to our strategic alignments and interests. Coming to Japan's strategic calculations as this great power competition is unfolding, as I was saying that if you look at Japan's strategy, it has pursued its geoeconomic and strategic interest in the US-China Japan triangle. I remember as a student I read a long time ago, around early 2000, when Richard Samuel said that Japan's grand strategy is actually dual hedge, where they pursue the security interests, safeguard security interests through its alliance with the United States, whereas it pursues its economic interests with China. Because we all know that even at the height of the Senkaku, tensions, in 2012, following the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, the bilateral trade still stood at $333 billion. And subsequently also, it never went down $300 billion. So that tells you a story of the kind of economic integration, the kind of, the regional value chains that has been cultivated over decades, which is so robust that, it actually makes you question the kind of economic interdependence logic that we are quite familiar with. And also, subsequently what has happened is in East Asia or in Southeast Asia, we are seeing the emergence of dual hierarchies, what John Ikenberry has mentioned, that the security hierarchy being dominated by the United States, whereas the economic hierarchy is dominated by China. So Japan is operating in this kind of geopolitical, framework. And coming to Trump administration, while robust alliance with the United States has been the fundamental or the pillar, the mainstay of Japanese foreign and security policy since the post-war years. And there has been no dilution. That is certainly, in my understanding, will continue to be the top priority for Abe administration and whichever administration follows. But alliance management and hedging against the fear of abandonment is a real concern under Trump administration, because we have seen he's a little unconventional in his understanding of how alliances operate. We have seen this hub and spoke system operating and sustaining the US-led order in the regions since the war. But a lot of those institutions has been challenged under President Trump. And it's a fact that Japan is probably little unfairly not given the latitude it deserves, because we have seen, particularly in geo-economic context, we have seen imposition of tariffs, whether it's steel or aluminum, employment of the defense, the Department of Commerce, the Act of 1962, which questioned the auto imports in terms of, national security challenge. So those kind of, and now pushing Japan to finally agree for a bilateral negotiation with the United States in terms of trade, which has been, which was not Japan's first choice. It has always opted for multilateral, frameworks when it comes, or free trade agreements when it comes to dealing with the United States. And there is this larger trend under Trump where he has questioned the merits of globalization. He has brought in protectionism, questioned free trade. So we have seen Japan actually stepped up and taken a global leadership role when it has successfully concluded the TPP. We have seen it has fast-tracked its own FTA with EU, which has come into effect earlier this month. So in RCEP also we see an acceleration of leadership role from the Japanese. So it's a very unconventional. It's quite unlike that. It actually was pushed to assume leadership on its own till the time US comes back to the entire free trade framework again. So. Given this situation, we have seen under Trump administration, we have seen Japan has revisited its China policy. And there are scholars, several scholars in Japan. For example, I was just reading one article by Akita where it was argued that Japan is actually going for a tactical détente with the Chinese. It is not that the fundamental core issues has been resolved between the two countries, because they are far greater when it comes to sovereignty issues or East China Sea developments. But given the economic scenario today and the great the trade war unfolding and how it is affecting both the economies, I think they have come together, and we have seen last year a very successful visit, and which culminated into several fruitful projects for the Japanese and also for the Chinese. So given this, we have seen that Prime Minister Abe has not only focused on internal balancing and external balancing. In external balancing, of course, as I said, the alliance with the United States stays the main, the fundamental pillar of its policies. But it is also backing it up with, diversifying its strategic partnerships with countries like Australia, countries like India, with ASEAN. And I remember in your national security strategy, it mentioned also about South Korea. But I don't know, given the state of relationship today, how that stands. But nevertheless, South Korea is also a U.S. partner. It also has robust economic relationships. So I'm sure once the political tensions are resolved, we'll be back to, business again. And also, if you look at the policy debate within Japan after the Cold War in terms of evolving foreign policy, we have seen that there were influential policymakers like Kanehara and Yachi. They have come up with a counter. Japan has long been critiqued for being an economic giant and a political dwarf during the Cold War. I think we all remember that after contributing $13 billion in the Gulf War, it was heavily criticized by no less than the United States as too little, too late. So since then, there has been a strategic debate as to how to orient Japan's foreign policy. Then we see these kind of influential policymakers like Kanehara writing a number of papers on Japan's grand strategy. And they said that the 21st century Japan should not just pursue power. It should also pursue justice based on universal values. And that is how the entire discourse on value-based diplomacy emerged in Japan. And as value-based diplomacy gained traction in the Japanese foreign policy, we have seen that India slowly started figuring in Japanese idea of Asia, whether it is Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, whether it is Confluence of the Two Seas, or the Quad initiative that we saw, or the Democratic Security Diamond, and now the Free and Open Indo Pacific Strategy. That is how India is situated in Japan's policy discourse. Now, coming to the concrete areas where we are seeking cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, first I would like to talk about regional connectivity and infrastructure initiatives. Now, Indo-Pacific is mapped both by India and Japan. If you look at our India-Japan Vision 2025. This is one area where we are not only working bilaterally, but we are also seeking trilateral and multilateral cooperation in terms of building regional infrastructure. Primarily, the goal is to build economic linkages, infrastructure and capacity building, nurturing value chains. As you know, India could not benefit from the kind of models of economic growth that we see in Southeast Asia or East Asia is not similar what happened in South Asia. So we are looking at, building and nurturing value chains and industrial networks. Intra-regional and inter-regional connectivity, particularly in Southeast Asia, South Asia. Now we are working together in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and also in Myanmar. We have seen some discourse emerging on Africa, though we have to really push that idea and pursue it. Okay. So that is something which is a priority. Also, I think we all agree that when we talk about infrastructure, it's just not geostrategy. It is also about, economic logic behind it. Because if you look at the infrastructure competition today, Japan's it's a twin goal, further geostrategic influence and also the economic development of Japan. If you look at the 2013 National Revitalization Strategy, it does talk about export of quality infrastructure and make new frontiers of growth in developing Asia, and India is one of the markets. That is why we saw subsequently EPQI coming in with a $200 billion investment commitment over 5 years, and we are also quite familiar with the ADB studies in terms of infrastructure requirement. I'll quickly rush through some of the regions where Japan has really, invested. One is the Northeast connectivity, which is extremely important for connecting India to Southeast Asia. We have been struggling in this area for quite some time, and this is also the strategic value of the region, just top of Bay of Bengal, and the ability to actually connect the continental India to, right up to Vietnam is something which is of fundamental importance to our Act East policy. And we all know that we have made some progress. Japanese ODA is being used in upgrading several national highways, and we are also doing certain, corridors with cooperation from the ADB. Bay of Bengal is another area. I'll not go into the details. We have taken very initial steps into collaborating in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, and in Sri Lanka. This is something where we can actually think of working in a trilateral framework. With US, we have this trilateral working group on infrastructure. This is with the BUILD Act and all, we can pump in more funds and build infrastructure. BRI, very quickly. India and Japan individually or bilaterally or regionally have supported infrastructure initiatives whenever it is at par with global norms, rules, and governance structures. We have seen certain, shift in Japan's policy, or we may question whether it is actually a shift. I was having a discussion with one of the Japanese professors, Kawashima sensei, and he was telling me it is actually not that Japan has changed its policy. It's a change in tactics and not policy, because according to his perception is that, initially it was, Japan is not joining BRI because of, it's questionable governance standards, whether it will be free, whether it will be transparent, so on and so forth. So now they have just turned around the discourse and says that our support is conditional once 1, 2, 3, 4, conditions are met. So it is not a dilution of Japanese position. We have seen they are already using BRI infrastructure. The Nippon Express example is quite in the public discourse now. We have our own reservations, which is completely different from Japanese position. Now, having said that, it's only economic logic that they have been working together. There is no denying the fact that the 50 agreements that we have seen during Prime Minister's visit, and Japanese and Chinese companies are working together for a very long time. So their understanding of each other is very deep. So if they decide to work together, it won't be a problem in terms of cultural understanding or operational understanding and so on. We have seen that we have conceived this AAGC project, which is struggling a little bit at the moment. I think it's too nascent an idea and too grand an idea. We need to put forward a lot of we need to invest a lot of understanding about each other, because Japan has its engagement to Africa through TCAD. We have our own engagement. But we have not really worked with Japan together in any third country for that matter. So in Africa is a very new area. So we have seen that we need to invest, very strategically and allocate resources very smartly in Africa. Probably we can target the east coast of Africa, which is of interest both in terms of our Indo-Pacific strategy and energy and economic interests. Quickly coming to the second point, securing maritime commons and upholding the rule-based maritime order is a priority. If you look at the National Security Strategy or the NDPG, which came out last month or last December, they all talk about this area, and we have been, there is a shared responsibility of safeguarding the regional slocks. In this area, we are closely working with Japan. We have a maritime dialogue, we have Malabar exercises, we have our own bilateral frameworks, and at the highest levels, we have 2+2 framework, which has been upgraded very recently. So that is something that we are, looking at. Moving on to ASEAN centrality, this is one area where we really need to develop the normative power of our relationship, because China has been really successful within ASEAN to create some fixtures. So there are various frameworks where we engage with Japan, the East Asia Summit. In fact, Japan has been critical in bringing India into East Asia Summit. China was not very open to our participation in East Asia Summit. In ARF, in ADMM+, there are several maritime issues, proliferation issues, terrorism issues, HADR issues where we cooperate. And then I would just wrap up by saying that Indo-Pacific is a vast geographic concept. So it is better that we should, focus our strategies according to the security, political, and economic requirements of each sub-region. If we apply one uniform policy to the entire expanse, it may not be very effective. And we need to prioritize our, resources, capabilities, and focus on conceiving projects and, most importantly, effective implementation of the projects. Deliverables are very important in terms of signaling, in terms of showcasing our, Indo-Pacific vision. Because we have conceived this vision in 2015, and this is 2019. We are yet to come up with any, concrete projects. So, as I said, Bay of Bengal, Southeast Asia, we should think about bringing Japan into the BIMSTEC orbit, and also work on, understanding Japan's professionalism, Japan's culture when we work with them. Africa, as I said, East Coast should be the target for developing cooperation. And also, just to wrap up, I would say that if we only analyze Indo-Pacific strategy through the prism of, balancing a Sino-centric Asian order or China containment, it may not deliver its full potential. So we need to, look at Indo-Pacific. We need to work individually, bilaterally, trilaterally to make China constructively engage in maintaining a liberal order. So I'll stop here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You've given us a lot on the plate, and we look forward to reading your detailed. You obviously done a lot of. But I really like that one sentence about Trump being unconventional in his understanding of how alliances work. I think that is the understatement of the year, I would think. But yes, you did raise a lot of thought-provoking things. The fact that we had ambiguity. Part of it we clarified at Shangri-La, partly. But after all, Shangri-La, of course, made provision for France to enter into the Indo-Pacific. Because France is squatting on a lot of maritime space. It has a member of parliament from the Indo-Pacific in the French parliament, from the island of Réunion. So, France is always there. And the fact that even as we are clear about what Indo-Pacific is, we are also part of the SCO. India is a part of the SCO. And thanks to the refoundation of Quad, Wuhan took place, and the India, China, Russia foreign ministers' annual meeting was on hold for many, many years. Suddenly the Chinese got interested in redoing it, So these are changing things which are happening all the time. But let me now take more time and request our last speaker, Arunima Gupta, and she'll be speaking to us on Indo-US relations and its implications on the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Shakti ji, for giving me this opportunity, and also the organizers. As Shakti ji mentioned, I'll be speaking on the Indo-US relations in the Indo-Pacific. Much has been said about it, and Italy made a very comfortable platform for me to segue from Japan to US here. Thank you for that. But before I dwell further into the multifaceted and the interesting contours of Indo-US relationship, I'd focus a bit on the Indo-Pacific as a strategic space. Today, we are witnessing global transitions, most prominent of them being an eastern shift of economic order and a geostrategic interest, the rise of China and its expansionist agenda that we'd all been hearing about, and a weakening of Western-led multilateral institutions. And it is in this context that Indo-Pacific has become a geopolitical hotbed. It has gained a strategic currency, and it is here that the countries of Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean has sought to increase their geopolitical play. While the Indo-Pacific in itself as a regional entity has witnessed robust trade and cultural linkages in the past, what is comparatively a new acknowledgement is that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean can be a shared strategic space. And this comes from two major developments that I would consider. First is the United States renaming the Hawaii-based U.S. Pacific Command as the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and the Trump administration repeatedly mentioning Indo-Pacific in tandem of geopolitical realities, which has brought India to the center of this geopolitical churn, what Italy mentioned as well. To put it in another way, I would say that Indo-Pacific has not only brought two geographical water bodies together, but it has also created a theater for two major stakeholders, India and the US, to realize their partnership taking into account each other's economic trajectory, political values, and strategic postures. This has not been a recent concept again. As was mentioned, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had mentioned it in his vision. The Australian White Paper had mentioned Indo-Pacific as well. But again, going to the Shangri-La dialogue, which led to some clarity of what Indo-Pacific would be for India, and when Prime Minister Modi reiterated the idea of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. This was a vision that the US shared as well, and it is to realize the shared vision that India and US have come together on a range of issues and areas which have considerable implications on the Indo-Pacific. So first would be the strengthening of the defense partnership between India and US. We saw in 2017 the National Security Strategy document of the US mentioned India as a major defense partner. This, I feel, considerably alleviated India's role in the dynamics of Indo-Pacific and how US perceived India. There has been a defense technology and trade initiative which serves as a bilateral platform for defense trade and technology sharing with greater ambitions at a faster pace. As I mentioned, the U.S. Pacific Command being renamed to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has been another important element of the U.S.-India relationship in the recent times. In the U.S. 2+2 dialogue, the India-U.S. 2+2 dialogue that happened, focused on the defense and the strengthening of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. We've also seen how the U.S. has sought to step up its defense budget, and it realizes that even though this stepping up is important, it may not be enough, and it would need partners like India to work in the Indo-Pacific realm. We signed the New Delhi Strategic Trade Authorization (STA1) agreement, and India is the only third country after Japan and South Korea to have the STA1 status. And this would mean that the high-end technology information sharing that India and US would have from now on would lead to a more sophisticated building of the security architecture in the region. The second point that I'd say was the India-US relationship that shares a commitment to maritime freedom and security. we've seen that there have been various dialogue mechanisms instituted, defense cooperation, and legal agreements to enhance security cooperation. In 2016, India and US held their first maritime security dialogue, an annual phenomenon which has been happening since then, which has explored the various avenues as well as challenges in the Indo-Pacific that the two countries would look at together. The 2+2 dialogue, again, concluded with the signing of the Communications Compatibility and the Security Agreement. We know it as COMCASA, and which enables New Delhi to get access to advanced US defense system. The two sides have also signed the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LEMOA, which includes white shipping arrangement to facilitate information sharing and commercial shipping, as well as naval maritime presence. Much recently, I think it was the chief commander at the US Pacific Command, mentioned how this would be important to check on the Chinese activities, where, as we see China using rather inappropriate mechanisms, which to call it as a piracy check, but something of this sort between India and US would bring a more robust relationship to counter-check China's activity. We see the annual Malabar exercise, which has now included Japan as well, which is a key military cooperation, improving coordination and interoperability. India also participates in the Rim of Pacific, which is one of the world's largest maritime warfare exercises. And it is in this light that India and US are focused on building a security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. It is various implications, and most important, as we've been speaking about, and I'd say that the third is the dealing with China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. As we know, the China's Belt and Road Initiative has invested heavily in infrastructure projects spanning across Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific. However, this mega connectivity projects has not been the most transparent and created room for China to defy international norms and democratic practices. It is in this context, I would say, that India-US relations, which rest on the shared democratic values, adherence to rule of law, and respect to territorial sovereignty, creates a maritime narrative that upholds shared aspiration of freedom of navigation and fair regional integration. India and US also realize that China cannot be excluded from their vision of Indo-Pacific, and this has been reiterated several times by both leaders on both sides. The realization has led the countries to cultivate a perspective of Indo-Pacific with China and other Indo-Pacific members to adhere to international norms. I see that this would lead to a more organic cultivation of the vision of Indo-Pacific, where connectivity is not imposed, but rather shared. India-US in this light should focus on normative principles, wherein they vision for various issues such as maritime trade, blue economy, and naval requirements and capabilities, which will form a bulk work of connectivity projects. This shared vision would strengthen regional integration, joint cooperation, as well as maritime awareness. Whereas India was the first country to outrightly speak against the Belt and Road Initiative, this realization came much later in other countries, as we see right now, Maldives, even Sri Lanka and Malaysia, realizing the adverse impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if a normative idea of a shared vision is cultivated, the China counterbalance, US and India can work very well on these aspects. Then I would say that the American vision of the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor supplements with India's Act East policy. And as Titli also mentioned here, the ASEAN centrality has been an important feature of not just India's Indo-Pacific policy, but also for Japan as well as US. The US and India cooperation in physical and soft infrastructure can link cross-border transport corridors, help create regional energy connections, and facilitate people-to-people interactions. One opportunity that I see India and US to work upon is to invest in Indian projects in Africa, such as the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, where I think US is still has held back its investment and its presence, so that can increase. The fourth and the last implication that I would say is that India-US relations has not just been fruitful bilaterally, but has also shaped its participation in multilateral mechanisms. Again, as mentioned, the Quad has seen the revival of Quad comes with the greater relation between India and US as well, the strengthening of the vision for shared and open Indo-Pacific. As democracies, all the 4 members of the Quad has been apprehensive of China's Belt and Road Initiative and has laid greater emphasis on rule of law, which is also reflected in navigational provisions such as the UN Convention on Laws of Sea, the peaceful settlements of dispute, free from coercion or force, as well as the free and open market and transparent infrastructure building. Again, I cannot lay enough emphasis on India's Act East policy and ASEAN centrality in the US-India relation. India and US have participated in the naval exercises and military deals, such as the Indonesian-led Komodo naval exercise, even though it was for a humanitarian aid and disaster management. This also shows the commitment that both countries have for a sustained and a peaceful Indo-Pacific. Singapore was invited to the 2007 Malabar naval maneuvers. And more importantly, both India and US has been a part of the multilateral exercises under the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus initiative. All this, I see, is contributing to building a secured regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific, which is foremost for achieving other visions, such as what has been time and again reiterated, as a peaceful Indo-Pacific, as a sustainable Indo-Pacific. And there's not much that I would like to add here again, but the recent signing of US, of the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act itself would further say that, as Titli mentioned, that even though there has been certain unconventional ways of Trump administration dealing with the Indo-Pacific, this shows that US is leaning forward in the Indo-Pacific and that its relation with India is going to stay strengthened in the coming years. I would not perceive it as any major hindrance, even though there have been certain talks about the challenges that India-US relations can have, such as CAATSA or the S-400 acquisition. But I don't see that India-US relations have any which ways impacted India's relationship with its other partners. To conclude, I would say that the implication of Indo-US relations in the Indo-Pacific is a significant measure for strengthening the regional architecture again, be it security architecture or economic architecture, and realizing the vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, which I see will only be strengthened in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to say I'll be unfair to you and ask you to go fast because we have overshot. But you were more than you seem to have read my mind, so I didn't have to be. We have a couple of minutes. We'll take. Let me ask for. Yes. You should come and speak one day, actually.
I think I have already. Apologies for speaking so much. But
it's good to see you.
But there's such fascinating topics and presented so well. Thank you to all the speakers. One, to temper a bit the dichotomy. Academia is about dichotomies and everything's inevitable and then everything changes. Japan peaceful, then not so peaceful. Well, the entire post-World War II period, Japan had one of the 3 or 4 most powerful self-defense forces in the world, even though constitutionally it wasn't allowed to have an army. So they just called the army a self-defense force, whatever. What's really changed there? The peaceful Japan also had revanchist and revisionist claims on islands that the San Francisco Treaty allocated to the USSR and then Russia. So peaceful Japan refused to sign a peace treaty with the USSR and still to this day refuses to sign a peace treaty with Russia. So there's no dichotomy there. There are Japanese national interests. It's always pushed like every country, and it's just pushing in different ways today. Now, perhaps what's changed, if anything has changed, is in the case of Russia and South Korea, Japan has revanchist, revisionist claims. In the case of China, China has claims on Japanese territory, the Senkaku Islands, which for all of that period that Japan was one of America's closest allies, what's changed is that for all of that period, while Japan was providing the logistics, the infrastructure, in a peaceful way to make the Korean War possible, and to a lesser extent the Vietnam War possible. That was Japan's peaceful contribution, and then later the Iraqi War. Throughout all of that period, one of Japan's major diplomatic claims from the US was, please help us defend the Senkaku Islands if the Chinese ever invade. And the Americans said quite openly, publicly and privately, no. The Japanese-American Security Treaty does not include the Senkaku Islands. But quite recently, that has changed towards the end of the Obama period. So that is a significant change that has happened that we need to take into account, that America stepped up, and in the latent dispute between China and Japan, which has always been there in the background, and China's never been able to do anything about it because of its economic weakness. But with economic strength comes military strength. And perhaps this explains where Japan is today. Because Abe's forefathers were also leaders of Japan, and leaders of Japan at a time when Japan, most of the world has forgotten, but China hasn't, launched a very vicious war on Chinese territories. Abe remembers. And Abe's frightened of what happens when China is in a position to do something about it. Now, in terms of claims, China has claims on Taiwan, which under international law are very dubious indeed. Holland has greater claims on Taiwan than China does under international law, but doesn't press those claims. The Taiwanese themselves actually have considerable claims to Taiwan. But under international law, China does have a case, as does Japan, over Senkakus, and ditto over the old Ryukyu Kingdom, which was a tributary kingdom of China. And I'm not saying they're legitimate claims, but they're more legitimate than the ones China is currently pressing on Taiwan. So you can see why Japan, at the highest, most official levels, is actually quite frightened, given that history and given the possibilities in the future with a very powerful China. Now, this is something China and India both have in common. India and Japan both have in common, is China lays claim to a considerable amount of territory of both those countries. That's a reality that nobody's mentioning. There's parts of northeast India where the Chinese refer to as southern Tibet. And actually, Chinese generals that I know have written books which were quite popular in Chinese, so they never reached the Western market, in Chinese about the coming war with India to reclaim those parts of South Tibet. So having said all of that, some questions. One, I'm Australian, so I have to ask a question about Australia. I already know the answer to this one, but I'd be interested in your answers, which may be more truthful than mine. The Malabar exercises, quadrilateral, great friendship, great strength between India, Japan, the US and Australia. Malabar exercises, military exercises between everybody but Australia. Why, is my question. And I ended up yesterday asking some controversial questions to wake everybody up at the end of the day. So I'll ask a very controversial one in the morning to wake everybody up first thing. Okay, military exercises, what are they about? Is it the ballet? Is it the cultural exchange of international politics? Or do militaries exercise together to fight a war together in the future? I think you know the answer to that one. So my question is, hypothetically, what are the wars? When these militaries exercise together, the Indian, Japanese, American, and sometimes the Australian military, what are the wars they are preparing for in the future? Because that's why militaries exercise together, to fight wars together. Thank you.
In the interest of economy, I'll answer on behalf of all three. I mean, I'm heavily over time. I will start with the last point. Why do armies exercise together? Is it about fighting a war? We exercise with the Chinese. Are we going to fight a war with the Chinese? No, we do very frequent exercise with the Chinese. Including the one on unarmed this thing against terrorist operations. We do a lot of it, Obviously, you are working to exercises to eventually develop greater interoperability. I don't think so there's any doubt about it. But exercises are also meant to let the others be a little reassured. In a defensive mechanism, what you think is a defensive step, the other guy thinks is an offensive step. So there are no easy answers to that, And obviously, I would only say countries obviously pursue their national interest. The China-Russia answer you know already. When did Russia first step onto those islands? After the bomb was dropped. After the bomb was dropped. So let's not get into that, 1 week before that. Okay, 1 week before that. So, yes, countries obviously work in their own interest. I would trust a country which works in its own interest than pretends not to work in its own interest. I don't think any of us would trust that country. Very quickly, Jaldi Kalman.
I have only two short observations. I seek your permission to be unconventional. First, about the gentleman. Sir, I will sum up only in one word. Power lies in the barrel of a gun. Number two, sir, I would like to compliment the. I would like to compliment the lady with your permission. Ma'am, I have Titli Basu. I have come across thousands and thousands of speakers and thousands of conferences. My humble, so to say, compliment to you. Your screening of the issues and analysis of the issues is a par excellence. I have never come across a person like that. In my opinion, it's my personal opinion. And my request is, please keep it up. You are young. Wishing you all the best. Thank you.
What is the controversy?
Can I just quickly respond? A, Russia was there before, but B... No. This is important because I also ask about Malabar. I agree with your argument about why military exercises are important. So then, why the lack of interest with interoperability with Australians? Do we smell?
The Australians don't pass the smell test at all times.
No, very quickly I can answer your question as a professor, a little bit theoretically. When you put why military exercises are actually, it's a foreign policy tool. We are living now in a post-Cold War world order where you find a lot of things are mixed up. And especially if you look at foreign policy, there are two components of foreign policy in today's world. One is the economic policy and the military policy. Military is essentially a component in foreign policy making of every country. And that's why so military exercises are actually foreign policy tools these days. Second, is of course involved a bit of signaling. No doubt about it. The realistic interpretation of any exercise is signaling your adversary that, look, we are prepared. The third component, which is more interesting, is learning the best practices from each other. And if you go back to 2004 tsunami, what happened? And in all the Asian waters, ASEAN waters, Indian Navy was present and America was watching from the satellite. They said, oh my God, Indian Navy is there. So why not start this military exercises since then, 2004 onwards?
You made the point, I think.
Yeah, welcome.
That is why I said,
welcome.
We'll talk over it over coffee. As I said.
That's because after 2007, you walked away.
No, that is the answer here also.
That is the answer we have.
That's the answer we have.
When we placed trust, we invited you, you walked away. So what do? We will call you again when we feel...
Till you have a consistent position of comfort to your partners, that you won't flip. Period. That is the open public answer to it. There's no secret about it. Absolutely, That's why I said you don't pass the smell test. That's all. On some aspects. On some parts of it.
The other one is, yes, it is true, Japan has territorial issues. India has territorial issues. The question is, how do you respond?
Yeah.
We have territorial issues with Bangladesh on St. Martin's Island. We did not construct an artificial island, convert it into a tourist place and then land fighter jets. Instead, we went to the international court. We lost the case. We handed over the territory. Japan has a territorial issue, yes, but is it flying its fighter aircrafts over other people's airspace on a daily basis? No. China does that 385 times in 2016 over Japanese airspace. So that's how it is. So the question is not when there is a concern about a country. It is not about whether we are overlooking certain facts. We are overlooking certain facts like Chinese violation of sea space, violation of airspace. So therefore there is a concern about that. So that is one of the things. Yes, Japan had history in the Second World War. It is tragic. What has happened in Second World War is exceptionally tragic. But how many European countries will pass the test? What about colonialism? How many European countries have a pacifist constitution? How many European countries call their armies as self-defense armies? What was the atrocities committed by European colonizers in Africa, Asia, and other places? So why do you have different sets of rules for Europeans and for Japanese?
And whatever the Japanese did in the Second World War did not prevent China accepting massive amounts of Japanese development assistance in the 1980s. See, if you want to remember history when it's convenient to you, it's, and sorry, now we have got diverted. The century of humiliation is applied to all of us. We have gone past it. I don't break it up because I want to rally people. So, therefore attitudes are very, very different. You can claim South Tibet. When did you first claim South Tibet? Now. You did not claim South Tibet all these years. You're very clear, Aksai Chin will leave us with us, we don't care on Arunachal Pradesh. Now suddenly it becomes South Tibet. If you're changing your negotiating position all the time, definitely it makes me uncomfortable. And therefore people who think alike, there are mistakes, but why should I pay for the sins of my grandfather all the time? We have to live and look forward, So that is the whole exercise. All of us have made it clear. We are not interested in being exclusive. If you want to follow the rules of the game, we are with you. I think that is all three presentations, that was the thing coming across very, very clearly. We are not being exclusive. We want to be inclusive as much as possible. But it has to be a reciprocal relationship. It cannot be, when it suits me, I'll be good with you. When it doesn't suit me, I'm walking away. That is what, is the main issue. But thank you for giving compliments to Titli Basu. I'm glad that young scholars, and let us now adjourn for tea. We'll come back in 10 minutes. Sanjay, fine, huh? We'll come back in 10 minutes. Let's give a round of applause to our three excellent presentations.